Good afternoon, bonjour à tous. A lively group, lots of good conversations going around the room, but if I could get your attention, we'd like to proceed with our program today. My name is Carmen Charette. I am a member of the board of the Federations for the Humanities and Social Sciences, as well as the Federation's treasurer. Let me begin by acknowledging that this event is on the traditional lands of the Songhees, the Saanich, and the Sooke First Nations people. Et nous les saluons fraternellement. The Federation is thrilled to be hosting this big thinking lecture here today, and I thank the Royal Society of Canada for allowing us once again to be part of your annual general meeting at this lovely venue. At the Federation, we look forward to growing our relationship and means of collaboration with the Royal Society of Canada, given our shared interests on so many research fronts. Je suis très heureuse de vous accueillir cet après-midi pour cette causerie « Voir grand », qui fait partie d'une série qui rapproche le grand public et la communauté de recherche en sciences humaines afin de rendre compte des décisions politiques qui affectent le quotidien des Canadiens et Canadiennes. La causerie Voir grand d'aujourd'hui portera sur l'importance de la réconciliation avec les peuples autochtones en tant que priorité pour tous les Canadiens. La Fédération s'est engagée à apporter son aide sur la question à travers une série d'initiatives auprès de nos membres et du public. The Federations hosts big thinking lectures on a number of occasions throughout the year, on the road, such as today, on Parliament Hill, approximately 6 times a year, and during our annual Congress. We are very much looking forward to the 2016 Congress of the Humanities and Social Sciences at the University of Calgary, which will be held this year from May 28th to June 3rd. As a matter of fact, this afternoon we have a number of people from the University of Calgary. In addition to today's big thinking speaker, Kathleen Mahoney, we also have Diane Kenyon, Vice President, University Relations from the University of Calgary. Diane, I thank you for your commitment to working with the Federation. Thus far, and in the months to come, and having been there, some of us here at UVic know what it involves, to make Congress the successful flagship event that our community has come to expect. Diane est vice-rectrice aux relations universitaires à University of Calgary depuis 2011. She has a wonderful track record of building effective and respected teams in large, complex organizations and launching innovative initiatives, which is definitely one of the reasons we believe that the 2016 Congress at University of Calgary will be a great success. I would like to invite you now, Diane, to the stage to introduce our afternoon speaker. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Carmen. Whoa. We're very pleased at the University of Calgary to be hosting the 2016 Congress of the Humanities and Social Sciences. Our 50th anniversary is next year on April 29th, 2016, and Congress is going to be a very, very important part of our 50th anniversary celebrations. The Congress theme next year is Energizing Communities, and we feel that's a very appropriate theme for the University of Calgary to be hosting Congress because we consider Calgary to be Canada's most enterprising city. So we are very thrilled to be hosting Congress next year. It is now my pleasure to introduce my colleague from the University of Calgary, Kathleen Mahoney. Kathleen is a professor of law, a fellow of the Royal Society of Canada, and also a visiting professor with Ulster University in Belfast. She was chief negotiator for the Assembly of First Nations for the historic Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement, achieving the largest settlement in Canadian history. She was also a major architect of Canada's Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Her visiting professorship at the University of Ulster involves working to assist survivors of institutional abuse to achieve redress and reconciliation in Northern Ireland. Her research interests include human rights, international humanitarian law, constitutional law, women's rights, and Aboriginal law. She's a pioneer in establishing judicial education programs on equality and difference. She has authored numerous papers and organized conferences, workshops, and collaborative international projects around the globe, including in Geneva, Australia, New Zealand, Africa, Spain, Israel, China, Vietnam, and the United States, and at the United Nations to advance judicial education programs globally. In November 2013, Kathleen was appointed Secretary of the National Academy of Social Sciences for the Royal Society of Canada. In her Big Thinking lecture, she will share with us today her suggestions on how to advance reconciliation with Aboriginal peoples by resetting Canada's origin story. Kathleen, the stage is now yours.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. And thank you, Diane, for that very nice introduction. Before I start, I too wish to acknowledge the Lekwungen people, which includes all of those nations that were described in other speakers' preliminary notes, on whose territory we're holding this meeting today. And I'd also like to say thank you to the Federation of Humanities and Social Sciences for giving me this great honor of presenting the Big Thinking lecture. I also thank you to my home university, the University of Calgary, for being the sponsor of this event. And of course, I am grateful for all of you joining me here today instead of walking on the seawall out in this beautiful city that we are in. My talk is entitled The Roadblock to Reconciliation, Canada's Origin Story. This first slide portrays the theme of my lecture, Canada hiding from the truth. Shedding light on the truth of Canada's past is especially important, I think, because in 2017, we will celebrate the 150th anniversary of Confederation, and we will be reflecting on how Canada was founded, how it developed, and what its values are. The origin story of Canada is always the starting point. As the story goes, Canada was founded by two nations, the British and the French, who created a constitution in 1867 that formed the bedrock of our Canadian identity and the basis for our evolution into what most Canadians like to believe we are, a caring, sharing, and peaceable nation, a nation that practices equality, a nation that believes in sunny ways. But here's the problem. This origin story is not true. It is incomplete, and it is misleading. In 1996, the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples wrote in their report, "A country cannot be built on a living lie." This lie, I argue, is in the story of Canada's origins. It has profoundly harmed our country and must be corrected. The failure to recognize the place of Indigenous peoples in the formation of Canada has tainted our origin story from day one. Unless we mend this broken tale, the celebration of the 150th anniversary, or the 150th years since Confederation in 2017, will become just one more in a long line of betrayals, of overlooking, ignoring, or downplaying the indelible influence and fundamental contributions of the First Peoples to this country. My proposal today is basically straightforward. we should celebrate the 150 years of Confederation by finally and officially telling the truth about Canada's founding through either an act of Parliament, a proclamation, or a parliamentary motion. This would give all Canadians, Indigenous and non-Indigenous alike, something to truly celebrate and rally around, while at the same time build the necessary context for discussion and action on the nation-to-nation relationship promised by the new Trudeau government. A recognition of Indigenous peoples as co-founders of the Canadian state will also build momentum for the implementation of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's recommendations. In support of this proposal, I will discuss 4 themes. First, the importance of origin stories and how Canada's is historically inaccurate. Second, the legal and philosophical justifications for denying recognition and why they must be rejected. Third, the deep and lasting harms caused by Canada's flawed origin story. And fourth, the importance of getting the origin story right. Because until we reckon with our past, reconciliation will be impossible, I think, and Canada will never become whole. The importance of origin stories cannot be underestimated. An origin story explains how a culture, or in this case, a nation, came into being. An origin story serves both epistemological and ontological functions. Every country, every community, every family has a story of origin to express who they are and where they have come from. Connecting our past to the present and explaining its relevance to everyday life helps us to navigate our world and to consider deep ethical questions about how we should conduct ourselves. A society with no stories, or stories that exclude some of its members, creates alienation, misunderstanding, and disaffection, like denying a person a name or a family its roots. When origin stories describe the beginnings of politics and power, they serve as scripts for citizenship, a form of consent to a political vision. For the past several years, our country has gone through a painful existential crisis with respect to our relationship with Indigenous peoples and how they have experienced Canadian citizenship compared to everyone else. The Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement, the apology in Parliament, and the report of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission all have revealed shocking facts contradicting many commonly held beliefs about Canada, its values, its origins as a nation, and what it means to be Canadian. The disconnect between our comfortable origin stories and the cultural genocide of Indigenous Canadians that went on for almost 2 centuries must be confronted. The great American writer James Baldwin's insight that people are trapped in history and history is trapped in them captures our identity crisis and calls for some explanation and understanding. Canada's commonly understood story of origin provides that our country came into being on the 1st of July, 1867, founded by 36 Fathers of Confederation that represented 2 races or peoples, the British and the French. British and French colonial leaders agreed to join the provinces of Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and Canada, which became the provinces of Ontario and Quebec, into one country. They drafted a constitution known as the British North America Act that was passed by the Parliament of the United Kingdom. This act, the first of several, brought the 3 provinces together. It set out the governance structure for the new country, including the division of powers between the new provinces and the new federal government. In addition, the Fathers of Confederation embedded protection of languages, cultures, and the civil rights of the British and the French. As time passed, more provinces joined Confederation, and Canada welcomed millions of immigrants from backgrounds other than British and French, and multiculturalism was added to the origin story. Parliament passed legislation recognizing multiculturalism for its historic contributions to Canadian society and characterized it as fundamental to our Canadian heritage. The legislation, in its preamble, briefly mentions that the rights of Aboriginal peoples in Canada are recognized. The fundamental character of the country, however, was and still is defined as bicultural, with the acknowledgement that ethnic groups, which include Indigenous peoples, according to the Multiculturalism Act, add value. The unique Indigenous contribution to the character of the country is erased by this legislation. It simply dumps Indigenous peoples in with immigrants who are neither French nor British. We can see this origin story repeatedly reinforced over the years. In 1963, for example, and that's what this slide is about, Prime Minister Lester Pearson convened the Royal Commission on Bilingualism and Biculturalism. In its introduction to the report of the Commission, it provides that, and I quote, "The Commission will not examine the question of the Indians and the Eskimos. Our terms of reference contain no allusion to Canada's native populations. They speak of two founding races, namely Canadians of British and French origin and other ethnic groups, but mention neither the Indians nor the Eskimos. Since it is obvious that these two groups do not form part of the founding races, as the phrase is used in the terms of reference, it would logically be necessary to include them under the heading other ethnic groups," end quote. In other words, understanding Canada as the product of anything other than British and French origins was unthinkable in 1963. Indigenous peoples were mere add-on, shoehorned into the Commission's terms of reference for ethnic groups as an afterthought. Now, from the Indigenous perspective, Canada's origin story is quite different. Indigenous Canadians point out that the British-French origin story fails to acknowledge the constant presence of their nations for thousands of years all over the land we call Canada. There were hundreds of Indigenous nations, as different from one another as the European nations were, with distinct cultures and unique knowledge and understanding of this part of the world. Before colonization, Indigenous peoples were self-determining, sovereign nations. They negotiated with one another, enforced their own laws and forms of governance and spiritual traditions. When the settlers landed, they welcomed them and provided land for them, entered into trade agreements and peace and friendship treaties with them, and fought alongside them as allies in colonial wars. Their knowledge systems, languages, and forms of social organization influenced the way the settlers survived and prospered. They were instrumental as well in the development of the fur trade that was the mainstay of colonial economies for more than 250 years. The fur trade opened the continent to exploration and settlement, missionary work, and social and other economic development. But by far the most significant contribution of the Indigenous nations to the building of the Canadian nation were the treaties the Crown entered into with them for vast tracts of land needed to make the country what it is today. I want you to take a moment to appreciate the vast areas of land we are talking about, lands that have produced immense riches, making Canada one of the wealthiest nations in the world, land that was the subject of legal agreements rooted in the Royal Proclamation of 1763, also known as the Indian Magna Carta and Canada's first constitutional document. It set the legal foundation for the Crown-Indigenous relationship, especially with respect to land rights, treaties, and the right of self-determination. While the proclamation gave ownership over North America to the British Crown, it explicitly states that Aboriginal title has existed and continues to exist, and that all land would be considered Aboriginal land until ceded by treaty. My colleague, Professor John Burrows, a distinguished member of the Royal Society and a professor here at the University of Victoria, makes the point that the proclamation was a vigorously negotiated document, a document subsequently ratified by 2,000 chiefs. It has never been repealed, evidence of that being its incorporation into the 1982 Constitution Act. And yet, once Britain gained effective control over North America, it breached its legal obligations under the proclamation. The British attitude changed from negotiation and respect of their treaty partners to elimination of them as legal and political entities. Large tracts of Indigenous lands were appropriated to house the settlers' ever-increasing demands. Imposition of the reserve system and assimilating the Indigenous population replaced the nation-to-nation relationship. It should therefore come as no surprise that at the Confederation table in 1867, there were no chairs for the Indigenous peoples. No one asked them if they wanted to be British subjects or Canadian citizens. Yet the decisions taken by the Fathers of Confederation would have profound implications for their future from that day forward. Instead of incorporating their sovereign rights guaranteed in the proclamation into the new Constitution, the Fathers of Confederation mandated that the federal government would have total control over, and I quote, Indians and lands reserved for the Indians. No protections for their languages, education, laws, or cultures were in the BNA Act. Those guarantees only applied to the British and the French, allowing their cultures to flourish ever since. After relegating the Indigenous peoples to virtual non-citizen status, it became easy for the Fathers of Confederation and subsequent governments to promote the myth that only the British and the French were responsible for the foundation of Canada. After Confederation, things got even worse. Indigenous peoples were herded onto smaller and smaller reserves to make way for more and more settlers and resource development. Today, Indigenous peoples occupy only 0.02% of the land mass of Canada. Sealing the deal on their structural inequality was the passage of the first Indian Act, a few years after Confederation in 1876, where just about every aspect of life of the Indigenous population came under the control of the federal bureaucracy. The Indian Act, inter alia, prohibited Indians from hiring lawyers to fight for their land rights, forbade the raising of funds to organize politically, mandated attendance at Indian residential schools, confined Indians to their reserves, criminalized cultural activities, took Indian status away from those who attended university, imposed alien forms of governance, redefined gender roles, and denied the right to vote. Apparently, it struck no one as improper to hand the control of an entire race to a branch of the federal bureaucracy. The land and resources taken from Indigenous nations without compensation or consent formed the foundation for the high quality of life enjoyed by other Canadians from then on. Only a small portion of resource income has ever come back to Indigenous peoples, usually in the form of transfer payments for social welfare. So how did this happen? Of course, none of this was done without some legal and philosophical justification. The two most important justifications were the discovery doctrine and the formal equality principle. The doctrine of discovery, with its origins in 1493 in the papal bull of Pope Alexander VI, was the legal fiction through which Europeans claimed rights of sovereignty and ownership of property in regions they claimed to discover. The doctrine held that Indigenous peoples could not claim ownership of their lands, but only rights of occupation and use. The formal equality principle, on the other hand, derives from the teachings of Plato and Aristotle, who understood equality to mean that likes were to be treated alike and unalikes treated unalike to the extent of their difference. The normative standard of comparison was set by those in power, so that in Athenian society there were clear distinctions between those who should rule, namely elite male landowners, and those who should not, namely common men, slaves, and women. The Fathers of Confederation adopted both the formal equality principle and the doctrine of discovery. Positions of power were open only to those who met the normative standard of an elite, landowning male class. This, combined with the doctrine of discovery, ensured the perpetual dominance of the British and the French founders and the permanent subordination of the Indigenous founders. The formal equality philosophy rationalized imposition of the Indian Act. It was justified because Indians and non-Indians were not alike. And so long as all Indians were treated alike, the laws met the standards the formal equality principle required. The flip side of formal equality is assimilation, a process whereby a person or group acquires the social and psychological characteristics of another group. Assimilation is seen as a solution to the problem of difference. And in the Canadian context, as the colonial settlements grew, Indians were seen as a problem that needed fixing through formal assimilation, and forced assimilation, I should say. The most egregious example of assimilation was the Indian residential schools policy. We now know that the government policy of assimilation through residential school education amounted to cultural genocide. The fact that government policy treated Indian children differently by destroying family bonds, their languages and cultures, and ultimately their identities as compared to non-Native children would not have raised eyebrows or alarm bells. Their difference made it okay. As long as all Indian children were treated alike, the problem of difference was being addressed through assimilation. And that was a good thing. Nicholas Flood Davin, Member of Parliament, wrote the Davin Report in 1879, shortly after Confederation. In it, he explicitly dictated the assimilation policy, saying the government must carry out the Indian residential school policy, and I'm quoting, until there is not a single Indian in Canada that has not been absorbed into the body politic. Duncan Campbell Scott, the Deputy Minister of Indian Affairs, was in charge of implementing the policy. He went so far as to refuse to close down certain schools where up to 43% of the children in them were dying from tuberculosis. He said, and I'm quoting, "This death rate does not justify a change in the policy of this department, which is geared towards a final solution of our Indian problem," end quote. He was also credited with saying, "We can't kill the Indian, but we can kill the Indian in the child." Campbell Scott came very close to setting a policy to actually kill Indian children, which was the accusation made by Dr. P.H. Bryce, a physician whose responsibility it was to investigate the health of Indian children in the tuberculosis-infested schools. And he tried to expose it in his book titled A National Crime after the federal government refused to make his report public. By the way, Duncan Campbell Scott was elected a Fellow of the Royal Society of Canada in 1899 and served as its president from 1921 to 1922, and he was named a Confederation poet. The Government of Canada's official biography of Campbell Scott is quite ironic. It says that Campbell Scott's widely recognized and valued Indian poems cemented his literary reputation. Finally, in 1989, the formal equality theory as a foundational legal concept was firmly rejected by the Supreme Court of Canada. The court said the concept, more often than not, perpetuates inequality. The discovery doctrine, too, has been discredited by all major human rights organizations and the United Nations as socially unjust, it's racist, and it's in violation of basic and fundamental Indigenous human rights. Had the British and French fathers of Confederation recognized and appreciated the importance and centrality of the contributions of Indigenous peoples to Canada, instead of being guided by assimilationist values, formal equality, and the doctrine of discovery, we would not now be trapped in the narrow framework of an origin story that has left Indigenous Canadians marginalized, dispossessed, and unrecognized, and the rest of us intellectually debilitated, morally disempowered, and personally depressed, wondering who we really are. So where does this leave us? The Idle No More movement, the Oka crisis, the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, the United Nations report of James Anaya, years of acrimonious litigation, roadblocks, and unresolved Indian land claims, the missing and murdered Aboriginal women, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. All of these say the same thing, that the division between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples in Canada has grown deeper and more hostile since Confederation. The paradox here is that as this divide grows deeper, our common destiny binds us ever more tightly together by imperiling all of us further. Put differently, the consequences of non-recognition have been harmful and costly to both Indigenous peoples and to all other Canadians. Disproportionate incarceration rates, suicide, poverty, high school dropout rates, lower life expectancy, poor health, unemployment, and addictions are too big a price to pay to maintain a status quo that cannot be morally, ethically, or legally justified. In 2016, the percentage of Indigenous students entering grade 1 in Manitoba will be over 30%. In Saskatchewan next year, 45% of all students entering kindergarten will be Indigenous. 2/3 of these children live in poverty, which is more than quadruple the national average. These children deserve better. Canada deserves better. Whether future conversations are about self-determination, the nation-to-nation relationship, the revitalization of Indigenous culture, or the sharing of land and resources, the depth of these issues and the acrimony they engender will never be fully understood unless Canadians embrace the true origin story of this country, understand where we went wrong, and fix it. The new federal government's mandate letters are encouraging. The Prime Minister's letter to the Minister of Indigenous and Northern Affairs states, and I'm quoting, "Your overarching goal will be to renew the relationship between Canada and Indigenous peoples. This renewal must be a nation-to-nation relationship based on recognition, rights, respect, cooperation, and partnership." This letter also provides that among the minister's top priorities is to support the work of reconciliation. I note that the mandate letter says renewal must be based on recognition, but it does not say what form that recognition should take. For the Parliament of Canada to recognize Indigenous peoples as equal partners in the founding of the nation would be an incredible good start and a powerful catalyst for reconciliation. But before I sit down, I would like to share a story with you about reconciliation and recognition. A member of the South Africa Truth Commission, his name is Reverend Bongani Finka, he told this story at a University of Calgary conference that was organized with the Assembly of First Nations and the law faculty at my university, told this story. It's called the cow story. There was a gentleman called Thabo, a black South African who had a cow. One day, Mr. Smith, a white South African, with greater economic and political power, took Thabo's cow away from him without permission or compensation. Thabo suffered from the loss of the cow. He lost his livelihood, he became poor, he became depressed, and he couldn't provide proper housing for his children or get them the things they needed to have a successful life. Many years later, the Truth and Reconciliation brought Thabo and Mr. Smith together in a process of reconciliation. Mr. Smith offered an apology, and Thabo accepted it. They hugged, they kissed, they even had a cup of tea together and shared a few jokes. At the end of the day, Mr. Smith got up to leave, and as he was going through the gate, Thabo asked, "Mr. Smith, what about the cow?" Mr. Smith said, "Thabo, you're messing up this thing about reconciliation. It's got nothing to do with the cow." I share this story because talking about the cow is where our commitment to reconciliation will be tested. Talking about the cow would mean being truthful about what divides us. It should mean talking about power, understanding who had power over the past so as to determine who should have power over the present. As Frantz Fanon tells us, those who control power control the way history is framed, control the story and the reality that flows from it. Talking about the cow may mean giving the pen to the First Peoples to write the master narrative. If that were the case, talking about the cow would mean honoring treaties and self-determination rights, preserving dying Indigenous languages, strengthening Indigenous culture and traditions, sharing economic opportunities, and appointing Indigenous Canadians to high positions of power. In other words, talking about the cow would lead us to all of the things that should have been the history of Indigenous peoples had they taken their rightful place at the Confederation table in 1867 as one of the three founding peoples. In conclusion, I have presented here a bold proposal. I believe the 150th anniversary of Confederation offers an opportunity for Canadians to reflect upon our origin story and set the record straight. However, setting the record straight by officially recognizing that Canada is a country of three founding peoples will not end the suffering. It will not heal all wounds or eradicate all poverty. But what it will do is create a powerful narrative that will become part of the shared story of every Canadian for generations to come. It will create a compelling platform for Indigenous peoples and for every level of government to achieve the real progress promised on issues most important to First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. To implement official recognition will require research and consultation between the leadership of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples and Canada to figure out the best parliamentary mechanism to achieve it. Whether this takes the form of a motion, a statute, or a proclamation would be decided by all of the parties. There are precedents for all three options. Reconciliation will not be easy. It is a multifaceted process that may take decades or generations even to achieve. It depends on attitudes, commitments, and circumstances, including the attitudes of Indigenous peoples about how much they wish to achieve within mainstream institutions. What is clear, however, is that reconciliation will not be achieved unless a climate conducive to its realization is fostered. Recognizing the true role of Indigenous peoples in Canada's story of origin will be the first step towards creating and nurturing that climate. I started my presentation with this slide. I think this one represents best my conclusion. It's time to start talking about the cow. Thank you, and miigwech. Questions? Oh, good, thank you.
I'm just going to borrow the microphone for a minute. Thank you so much, Kathleen, for a very inspiring and for also challenging us in building that better understanding of our true origins as a country. We have a few minutes, about 10 minutes for questions. Vous pouvez poser vos questions en français ou en anglais. There are microphones, so I'd invite you to come to the microphone, introduce yourself, and Kathleen will be happy to continue the conversation.
Maybe there are none.
Any questions? Good.
I'll ask one because no one else has. My name is James Dossman. I'm from the University of Saskatchewan. One of our projects is to work with some First Nations community looking at the relationship between housing and health issues. And that's involved our group working with the communities, looking at children from the schools. And you know, many of the children come to school and they're tired and they're lethargic and they haven't had much sleep. And how do you get at that? I mean, it's extremely fundamental. I'm sure you think you've thought of all these issues. Mm-hmm. How do we think about these issues?
Well, you've put your finger on an extremely important problem, and one of the central issues that hopefully addressing the poverty of Indigenous children will address, because when people are living 4 and 5 families in a 1 or 2 bedroom little home, they don't have proper situation to rest. And often we've heard in communities such as Attawapiskat and others that families actually take shifts sleeping in the beds, and so parents will stay up all night so the child can get some sleep. So, I mean, we privileged people have a very difficult time understanding what poverty really looks like. And that's one of the manifestations, is that children come to school fatigued because they don't have the proper housing where they can get good rest and good food and so on. So I think that when your group looks at housing issues and poverty issues, they have to comprehend how people in poverty are actually living and how to tackle that. Because if a person, you're absolutely right, can't get a good sleep, it's very difficult to learn. And there are some very encouraging projects going on in Ontario. We're just at a fundraiser recently in Toronto where they're raising funds for teachers to go into remote Indigenous communities and dealing with precisely the kinds of issues you raise. Paul Martin, the former Prime Minister, has a very exciting education program for Indigenous youth that is holistic. You can't teach it, just say you're going to teach a child without looking at all of the aspects of their existence, which interferes with their ability to learn. So thank you for the question.
Thank you. Yes, please.
Hi, my name is Gabby Ibarguchi, and I'm currently based at the University of Calgary at the Arctic Institute. I'm actually Mexican, so we have our own stories of Indigenous people in Latin America. Mm-hmm. Sadly, a lot of it is assimilation. A lot of its extinction. But what I wanted to mention is that it's very interesting actually working with Arctic researchers, because in our various disciplines, so working as a biologist, I get a chance to sometimes go out in the field and work with people who love nature as much as we do. And they have a lot to teach us, of course. And I have not worked as a social scientist in the North. And that's a very different experience. But I'll tell you something I'm kind of bumping into lately in my work. And that is that a lot of countries who are now working in the Arctic are asking Canadians, how do you work with people from the North? How do you work with Aboriginal peoples? And a lot of us we perhaps don't have the knowledge we should, but what I want to draw your attention to is that as Canadians, more and more people want to know what we're doing, and they think we're doing the right thing. And so we really have to get up to speed and make sure we are doing the right thing. So I just want to mention that because I am amazed how often that happens. Mm-hmm. We were at some meetings in Japan, and we were having dinner with a number of colleagues there, and they are amazing at polar research. They've been doing Antarctic research for a long time and very good Arctic research. And they don't have the experience we have in Canada, which is, we still have people living in the North, and so they ask us, how do we do it? So I just wanted to let you know that. And working with colleagues in Norway, for example, and not as often as we would like, but also our colleagues in Russia, they have more experience working with Sami people. And I just want to share a message that we've been told over and over, working with Sami people, and this was just very boldly stated, and it's that, this is what they were saying to us. We appreciate that scientists now understand that traditional knowledge is basically science, observations. However, don't come and ask us for a traditional knowledge. They say, make us your partners. I'll follow up. Right. So I just wanted to share that with you. That's their message, and maybe something we can work with as well here.
Well, thank you, Gabby, and that's an extremely important message. And that also is part of our history in Canada, is that non-Aboriginal Canadians have thought for many centuries that running roughshod over the Indigenous peoples was the way to do things, and that it wasn't worthwhile explaining or engaging with an equality sentiment or principle behind what they were doing. And so that's why we have a lot of the injustices and lack of understanding between the Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal populations. So there's organizations now, quite a number of them, who exist precisely for that purpose, Indigenous organizations who work with, be it business, universities, and so on, to educate them about the values and cultural standards and priorities of First Nations people and Inuit and Métis. So thank you for that insight. That's very, very important. I agree.
One last question.
Merci. Bonjour, Kathleen, mon
Bonjour,
ancienne
Guy.
collègue de l'Université de Calgary. My question would be as follows. When you talk about the reconciliation that would take place, at least in this talk, I got the impression that you meant that this reconciliation would take place with Parliament and the central government, or what is now called, but was not called like that 40 years ago, the Government of Canada. Now, that possibly would be helpful, but it would also be wrong with regards to the origin you mentioned, which was that Canada in the 19th century was not a unitary, but rather a federal country. So to integrate that dimension of the complexity of the origin, what's the place for federalism in your approach towards reconciliation between three founding peoples?
Well, I think that's a very good question, and a number of people are concerned about that very issue, Guy. Thank you for the question. I think the reality is that we are a federation, that different nations operate within. That's true for First Nations to some limited degree, and it's true for the provinces. So I don't see it as a problem in that sense. I see that obviously the notion of nationhood is going to be a big item on the agenda coming up with this new government, because they've promised nation-to-nation relationship. But I don't think the concept is nations seceding from the Federation. I think the vast majority of Indigenous nations see themselves as within the Federation, but are very anxious for more powers to self-determine their way of life and their governance in their local communities. So I don't think it's impossible, but I think what's important here is the symbolism of such a declaration or such an acknowledgement, that we haven't appreciated the contribution, the fundamental contribution towards this country, and if we do so, that will set the foundation for the kinds of discussions that need to follow now, because I think we're in a new frame. At least I hope we are, Guy, and I thank you for the question. I think we could talk about this for a lot longer, but I'm quite conscious of the passage of time. I think there's one more. No?
Yes.
Definitely the last one.
Okay.
Okay. My name is Alain Beaulieu. I'm from Quebec. And can I speak French to you?
I'd prefer English if you
Yes,
don't mind.
yes, but
I
I'm very
apologize,
bad. I'm very bad in English. In Quebec, we have. I think it's especially issue in Quebec. But pardon me. Ah oui. Si vous voulez.
Okay.
En français. Bon, ok. Il y a une question qui se pose d'une manière particulière, je crois, au Québec, et que vous n'avez pas abordée, qui est la question du métissage. C'est-à-dire la reconnaissance de ce qui nous unit aux Premières Nations, je dirais, de manière historique, mais qu'on a aussi de manière historique occultée, pour toutes sortes de raisons. Spécifiquement au Québec, pour des raisons, je dirais, religieuses. En fait, c'est l'Église, je crois, qui a joué un rôle important dans le fait qu'on a voulu préserver la langue française, donc préserver le lien privilégié que nous avions avec la France, et occulter d'une certaine manière les relations, les mariages qui ne portaient pas ce nom-là entre des Français, essentiellement entre des Français et des Autochtones. Et tout ce côté, toute cette dimension métisse qui définit aussi le Canada, qui l'a défini d'une manière très particulière aussi dans son histoire, et qu'on a combattu de manière virulente aussi, justement pour nier ce qui aurait pu créer d'une certaine manière une nouvelle nation, donc unifiée par le métissage. Et dans le fond, la ségrégation était une négation d'un métissage qui était là déjà présents et qu'on a voulu occulter autant dans l'aspect mythique de ce qu'on est comme pays. Donc, la représentation qu'on a de nous-mêmes découle de cette occultation.
So the question is around the Métis
Okay.
relationships.
Okay.
And how does that factor into
Okay.
this, and how it is could have been a source of building better relationship, and how we denied those also.
Well, I certainly wouldn't shy away from that proposition. The Métis, too, and when I talk about Indigenous peoples, I'm including the Métis Inuit and the First Nations. And in fact, we had a conversation with Clem Chartier before giving this talk. I just wanted to make sure I was touching my bases and spoke with the leadership of the Indigenous communities. And he was very excited about this concept, about nation-to-nation discussions. And certainly the Métis see themselves as a nation, and not unlike Quebec, as it was declared by the Harper government to be a nation, and yet within the Federation. And they're seeking also a relationship which has been bolstered significantly by the courts in recent decisions. So that is on the table, I think, absolutely, I would agree.
Thank you. Merci beaucoup, Kathleen, pour cette présentation sur comprendre mieux nos origines. Je pense que ça nous fera réfléchir. There's a lot to be talked about moving forward, and a lot to do. I'd like now to invite Constance to close the session. Again, thank you very much for being here today, and again, grand merci.
Thanks. I didn't have to stay here, do I?
Ceci conclut notre déjeuner causerie voix grande. Professeur Mahoney, merci d'avoir partagé avec nous votre passion. Merci encore à la trésorière Carmen Charette et la directrice des politiques et programmes Gauri Srinivasan de la Fédération des sciences humaines, ainsi qu'à la vice-rectrice aux relations extérieures, Diane Kenyon, et la vice-rectrice associée à la recherche, Anne Katzenberg, de l'University of Calgary. This event was made possible through the generous support of both these institutions. Before you leave, I would like to remind you of two things. The first is that the induction and awards ceremony is this afternoon at 4 p.m. in the theater. The second is that the annual business meeting for fellows and college members of the Society takes place tomorrow at 2 p.m. in the theater. We hope to see you all there. Thank you, merci, et megwich.